There's an old superstition in our town. When a family is twins, one child is punished, so the other learns from their mistakes. That is how you keep them in line and make sure they grow up safe. I am born 4 minutes before my sister, Jewel Skinner, so I become the one who pays for her wrongdoings. When Jewel sneaks off to swim in the river, Mom doesn't yell at her once, and instead she holds my head down and forces it underwater repeatedly. Mom doesn't let go until Jewel is crying and screaming, "I'll never go swimming there again." Once Jewel forgets to cook the pasta, when Mom gets home from work, the package is still sitting on the counter. So Mom puts 2 bowls of uncooked pasta in front of me and says, "Eat it all. Don't leave a single piece." The dry pasta cut the inside of my mouth until it bleeds. Mom watches Jewel's reaction the whole time. She doesn't take the bowls away until Jewel starts crying. For 16 years, I am the one who pays for Jewel's mistakes. Then that year, a hurricane heads straight for us. The evacuation orders come that night, and the whole town is told to leave. Jewel stays out with her friends until the middle of the night. When she finally comes home, she is soaked through and still laughing. Mom shoves her into one of the evacuation vehicles. She turns to me and says calmly, "You stay here. Once the hurricane passes, Jewel will know better than to come home late again." Everyone in town is gone and roof tiles begin flying off one after another. "Mom, you always make me suffer." So Jewel learns her lesson.
Time.
I really am going to die. Are you satisfied now? Where did Jewel run off to? Now we're getting hit by a major hurricane tonight. My mom, Lucinda Parker, said it was already pitch black outside. The wind sent a metal basin rolling across the yard. Red alert, evacuate the entire town. Evacuation vehicles will arrive at the town entrance in 20 minutes. Mom whipped around to face me. She looked furious as she snapped, "You get out there and find Jewel." "Mom." Jewel said she went to a friend's house. With the weather outside, Mom cut me off like I care whose house she went to. "Go get her now. If you can't find her, don't come home." I instinctively looked at Dad sitting in the corner, who started to speak up. "The wind really is too strong. Maybe we should wait a little." "Shut the hell up," Mom barked, not even turning around. "If something happens to Jewel, can you take responsibility?" I slipped on my shoes. The sole's already coming apart. The moment I opened the door, the wind nearly knocked me off my feet. I was about to head to the west side of town where Jewel's friend lived when a giggle came from behind me. I turned around. Jewel Skinner came running out of the alley, soaked through and looking thrilled. Mom's voice was full of relief and worry. "You're finally home. Are you soaked? Are you cold? Get inside and change before you catch a cold." I stood in the pouring rain, soaked through and shivering in the wind, but Mom didn't even spare me a glance. Mom wrapped Jewel in a blanket and put her in the back seat. I followed behind them and moved to step onto the running board. "What are you doing?" Mom stopped me. "You know the rules." Jewel stayed out having fun and nearly didn't make it home. "Tonight, stay here. That'll teach her what it means to be afraid."
Jewel panicked.
Inside the vehicle, she pressed against the window and screamed, "Mom, no. Don't leave Alice here. Something bad will happen to her. The hurricane. So now you're scared? Why didn't you think of that when you went out?" Mom cut her off sharply. "Alice is being punished because of you." Mom didn't budge as she turned and ran back inside. When she came out, she was carrying our dog, Goldie. She put Goldie in the last empty seat, as if she had every right to. "Goldie's an animal. He doesn't know how to find shelter, so I have to take him." Then she looked at me and said, "Alice, you're a person. You know how to find somewhere to hide." Dad sat in the front seat, looking as if he had something to say. But when Mom looked at him, he turned toward the window. Mom held Jewel's head down, so she couldn't look at me. The engine started. The taillights left 2 red streaks through the downpour. Growing farther and farther away, the lights of Larkton slowly went out. I was left standing alone in the storm. Suddenly, someone shouted from the darkness, "I've got a seat." The voice came from the last vehicle. I squinted through the rain, but I could barely see anything. A hunched figure leaned out from behind the door and waved at me. It was Logan Zane from next door. For as far back as I could remember, he had always treated me like his own granddaughter. Whenever Mom punished me by not letting me eat, he would wait until she wasn't looking and slip a bowl of hot oatmeal through the back door. Logan squeezed out of his seat to make room for me and called out, "There's enough room. Just squeeze in." I ran toward the vehicle, where Logan was already reaching out to pull me in. Just as my fingers were about to touch his, I heard someone yell, "Logan is a kidnapper." Mom's voice suddenly came from the vehicle in front. She had rolled down the window and leaned halfway out. She pointed at Logan and screamed, "He's trying to kidnap my daughter. Don't let her get in his car." Logan was at a complete loss for words. "Lucinda, what are you saying?" Logan's voice trembled. "I'm Logan Zane. I've lived next to your family for years." "I don't care who you are," Mom yelled. "You're an old man living alone, and you're way too interested in Alice. Who knows what you're really after?" Logan's lips turned pale with anger. "I'm kind to Alice because I feel sorry for her. Everyone in this town knows how you treat her. Alice is my daughter. How I raise her is none of your business." Mom didn't even flinch as she said that. "She's safest in her own home." In the passenger seat, I saw Dad's hand rest on the door handle. Mom slowly turned to look at him. "If you dare open that door, I'm taking Alice and Jewel to my parents' house tomorrow. You'll never see them again." Dad slowly let go of the handle, one finger at a time. He turned away and didn't look at me again. The evacuation team captain jumped out of the first vehicle. He looked at the sky and went pale. "The hurricane I will hit in an hour. If we don't leave now, no one gets out." Two townspeople dragged Logan back into the vehicle. He clung to the door frame and shouted, "Get to the old church at the edge of town. It's built of brick. Do you hear me? Run to the church." I stood frozen to the spot. Watching the taillights disappear one by one, I turned and ran toward the edge of town. The church Logan mentioned was at the end of the old street. Roof tiles were ripped off one by one and shattered on the ground. The wind tore a huge old tree out by the roots and sent it crashing into the middle of the street, completely blocking the road. I had no choice but to go back home. Half the roof was already gone. Rain poured straight inside, flooding the living room. Curled up in the corner under the kitchen counter, the three sides were made of brick and the concrete slab above gave me just enough cover. Water poured in through the gaps in the door and walls. It rose past my ankles, then up to my calves. Just then, my phone rang in my pocket. It was Jewel calling. Her voice was shaky with tears as she said, "Alice, are you okay? Where are you?" "I'm okay." I gritted my teeth to keep my voice from trembling. "Did you make it?" "Yeah, we're at the emergency shelter hotel in the city. There's hot water and blankets. The staff even made us some tea," she replied. Jewel started sobbing again. "Alice, I'm so scared. What are you going to do all alone at home?" A deafening crash came from above me. The other half of the roof had been torn away and rain rushed inside. It's nothing. The wind just blew off bits of the roof," I replied. I could hear Jewel crying out on the other end of the line, "Mom, the house around Alice is collapsing. You have to do something." Then I heard Mom say if she can still make a phone call, she's fine. "You're always making a big deal out of nothing." Mom cut Jewel off. What could happen to Alice at home? Dad rebuilt that kitchen counter 2 years ago. It's sturdy. If she can't handle a little wind and rain, how is she ever going to make it on her own? Then she said to Jewel, "That's enough. Tell Alice to hang up. He's wasting money on the call." I crouched in the water, without saying a word. It had already reached my thighs. Jewel was still crying as she told me between sobs, "Alice, try to get somewhere higher." Just then, an unfamiliar man's voice came through. He sounded urgent and alarmed. Jewel sobbed, "It's my sister. She's still at home. She didn't evacuate." "What?" The man's voice rose sharply. "There's still someone back there. There's already a flash flood warning. People could die." That man's voice cut through the chaos. "Are her parents here? I need this kid's parents over here."
"How could you leave a child behind?"
Mom's voice came through at that moment. "Alice will be fine. She's tough." At the same time, the signal was completely gone. The light from my phone went out too soon. The water reached my waist, then my chest. There was less and less room beneath the kitchen counter. I clung to the brick pillar beneath it, digging my nails into the cracks. It was so cold. The freezing water and wind chilled me to the bone. I remembered one time when Jewel refused to wear a jacket because she wanted to play outside. In the end, she caught a cold. That night, Mom made me stand outside in my pajamas in the middle of winter. She only let me back in when my fever reached 104 degrees and Jewel broke down crying. The water rose past my neck. I couldn't hold on to the brick pillar anymore, for my fingers had no strength left. Mom said I was tough, but I wasn't as tough as she thought. I couldn't hear anything anymore, and my consciousness had started slipping away. Just before I blacked out, someone shouted from nearby, "He's here." The volunteers pulled me onto a rescue boat. After 3 rounds of CPR, I finally coughed up water and had a faint heartbeat. Patient experienced drowning and prolonged oxygen deprivation. Her lungs are full of fluid. Prepare to intubate and notify the operating room. Then he shouted into the hallway, "Where's her family? We need a family member to sign." Mom walked over without a hint of urgency. "Who told you to save her? She's still alive, isn't she?" "I bet she's faking it. She's been pretending since she was little," Mom said. A nurse was the first to react. "We got in there 30 seconds later. She would have died. Sign the surgical consent form now." Mom ignored the nurse. Mom looked at her and spoke calmly. "Have you learned your lesson yet?" She pulled a pen from her purse. I grabbed a sheet of paper from the nurse's station and slapped it in front of Jewel. "Write a 300-word apology once you're done and admit what you did wrong." "I'll sign the consent form," the nurse shouted. "Are you out of your mind? That child inside is waiting for surgery. Every minute you delay." Mom cut her off without even looking at her. "I'm disciplining my daughter." "It's none of your business." Then she pulled up a chair, sat down, and took out her phone to scroll through short clips. Jewel was bent over the hallway bench, her hand shaking so badly she could barely hold the pen. She stopped and looked up at Mom, saying, "Mom, please just sign it first." This whole thing wasn't Alice's fault. It wasn't her fault. Mom didn't even look up from her phone. "But she has to pay the price, so you'll remember what you did wrong." Dad glanced at the sign outside the ER, then at Mom, who was still sitting there scrolling through her phone. "Lucinda, that's enough. Just sign it." "Alice's. You always say that's enough." Mom finally looked up. "That's why Jewel never learns. Stay out of it." Just then, Jewel stopped writing. She slid off the bench and collapsed onto the floor, holding up the tear-stained paper. "Mom, I'm done. Please save Alice, please." Mom took the paper from her and read it carefully. "Your handwriting is still a little sloppy, but I'll let it go this time." Mom folded the paper, put it in her purse, and slowly stood up. She looked toward the ER operating theater, almost sounding wistful. This time Alice really suffered. But if it taught you a lesson, then her punishment was worth it. Once this hurricane passes, I'll buy her a couple of new dresses to make it up to her. I'm just doing this for her own good. Mom turned to the nurse and picked up a pen. "Bring me the surgical consent form." Just then, the light above the ER went out. The hallway fell silent. For one terrifying second, everyone thought the hospital had lost power. Then the emergency generator roared to life. The red operating light didn't come back on.
It changed.
Operation terminated. The nurse standing beside Mom froze. The surgeon pushed through the doors with blood on his gloves and ripped off his mask. "Who's Alice Skinner's guardian?" Mom immediately stepped forward, smoothing her hair as if she were checking into a hotel. "I'm her mother." The surgeon stared at her for a long moment. "You signed 4 minutes too late." Mom frowned. "What do you mean?" "We performed every emergency procedure we legally could while waiting for consent." Her heart stopped again during surgery. He lowered his eyes. "We couldn't bring her back." The hallway exploded. Jewel let out a scream so raw it echoed through the entire floor. Dad stumbled backward until he hit the wall, then slid to the ground with both hands over his face. Mom didn't cry. She laughed once, softly. "Stop joking. Alice loves pretending." No one answered. The surgeon simply handed her a death certificate. Time of death, 3:17 a.m. Mom looked at the paper, then back at the operating room, then at the paper again. "This is fake." She crumpled it into a ball. "My daughter is stubborn. She's probably lying there waiting for me to apologize." The nurse who had argued with her all night finally snapped. Your daughter died waiting for you to stop punishing her. You delayed consent. You abandoned her during an evacuation. And the last thing she heard was you calling her suffering worth it. Every person in the hallway turned to look at Lucinda. Not with sympathy. With disgust. The funeral happened 3 days later. The hurricane had flattened half of Larkton. Alice's coffin was small enough that 4 volunteers carried it instead of 6. Logan Zane stood in the front row with a bouquet of white lilies. He had spent 2 days helping search the flooded streets because he refused to believe Alice had died. Now he placed the flowers on her coffin with shaking hands. I'm sorry I couldn't reach you. Jewel collapsed beside the casket. I'm sorry, she sobbed over and over. I should have jumped out of that car. I should have stayed with you. Dad couldn't even approach the coffin. He stood 20 feet away, crying like a child. Only Lucinda remained perfectly composed. When people offered condolences, she replied with the same sentence every time. Alice understood why I did it. The town finally lost its patience. An elderly woman stepped forward. My grandson died in that hurricane. I've buried enough children, but you're the first mother I've ever met who treats one like a lesson. One by one, people walked away from Lucinda. By the end of the funeral, she was standing alone. The investigation began the following week. The evacuation captain submitted his report. The rescue volunteers submitted theirs. The hospital handed over security footage from a hallway. It showed the exact timestamps. Alice arriving unconscious. Doctors begging for consent. Lucinda refusing while scrolling through videos. Jewel writing an apology. The consent signed only after 23 minutes had passed. The footage spread through town before the trial even began. No one could watch the hallway video without crying. Lucinda became known by a new name, the Hurricane Mother. Child Protective Services opened an investigation into years of abuse. Teachers came forward. Neighbors testified. Logan described sneaking Alice food through the back door. Even Dad admitted the truth. I watched it happen for 16 years. His confession was almost as heartbreaking as Alice's death, because everyone asked him the same question. Why didn't you save her? He never had an answer. Jewel stopped speaking for nearly 2 months. When she finally did, her first words were spoken in court. She stood before the judge clutching the same apology letter Mom had forced her to write. It's all backwards. My sister never deserved punishment. I did. Then she tore the apology into tiny pieces. I won't let Alice keep paying for my mistakes anymore. The courtroom was silent. Lucinda still refused to apologize. I raised my daughters the only way I knew. The judge interrupted her.
No.
You abused one child to manipulate another. That isn't discipline. That is cruelty. Lucinda received a prison sentence for child abuse and criminal negligence resulting in death. As deputies led her away, she shouted toward Jewel. You're going to thank me one day. Jewel didn't even turn around.
Epilogue.
A year later, the rebuilt church stood on the hill overlooking the new town. Behind it grew a single cherry tree planted in Alice's memory. Its plaque read, Alice Skinner, she spent 16 years carrying someone else's punishment. May no child ever do so again. Every spring, Jewel left 2 things beneath the tree. A bowl of cooked pasta, and a little paper boat for the river Alice had never been allowed to enjoy. Logan would sit beside the tree with 2 cups of hot oatmeal, placing one beside him out of habit. He always smiled sadly. I saved you a seat, kiddo. And for the first time in Larkton's history, the old superstition disappeared forever. No family ever punished one twin for the other's mistakes again.